thank you for having me today. It's really lovely to have the opportunity to kind of talk about my work. It's always nice. So today I'm going to be talking about both my academic and creative work related to archaeology and video games. And I'm currently a PhD researcher in computer science, but before I had a completely different life. I actually worked for 7 years as a field archaeologist and heritage consultant in London. And I also did fieldwork in the Mediterranean, as you can see in this picture here. I always put that there because it looks really picturesque and it's like nice to remind myself. I wasn't always behind a computer screen all the time, even though I love it. But also I've done kind of work on the indie game Sotzi Chronicles. I was in the writer's room on that, so I've done kind of games writing, narrative design work. And also collaborated with the British Library on their digital storytelling exhibition last year, where I created some playthrough videos for them and kind of did some work around games preservation, which I'm really interested in. So that kind of hopefully gives you a little bit of a flavor of all of the other kind of like games and non-games related stuff that I do. And yeah, this talk should be about kind of half an hour, and this is the structure of it is I'm kind of going to look at kind of 3 broad themes and then have corresponding case studies to go along with it. There's probably more of the academic stuff towards the beginning. I'm hoping that'll work out better as it goes along. So first, Nick already mentioned archaeogaming, and when I tell people that I do archaeological studies of video games, or I study the archaeology of video games, they often say, well, what does that mean? And I think the answer is obvious. Maybe not, just joking. No, but actually, Lara Croft, of course, is probably the most famous archaeologist in video games, and actually, archaeology is very in pop culture a lot, right? In film, video games, all kinds of things. And so archaeogaming can be kind of summarized in this Venn diagram here of looking at the representation of archaeology and heritage in video games, and that includes sort of like the ethics of things like looting practices. And of course, I mean, Lara Croft is literally in a series called The Tomb Raider, the series, right? And that says a lot. But also it could be about developing archaeological games about heritage, but also kind of applying archaeological theory and method to games as well, which is something that I'm very interested in. And yeah, just got a couple of examples of kind of the broad range of different things that I've looked at, including I did kind of like this journal study where, yeah, I did a journal of night walking while playing Pokemon Go, like the experience of playing that at night, and even, say, for example, trying to record a playthrough of Quiz and Love at the End of the World in a single GIF because it's only 10 seconds long. So those are just kind of like a few kind of small examples of stuff I've done. But a proper case study to look into, as mentioned already, is Elden Ring. And more broadly, I'm really interested in kind of how games already have mechanics which are about, are akin to archaeological recording, right? So that could be photography, for example. There are a lot of games around photography, but also games often use mechanics around, say, like journaling, and this is also something that archaeologists in the real world use, like having field notes and things like that. And so this brings me on to Elden Ring. Something that I like to talk about kind of as an academic is sort of like personal motivations for doing work. So I think oftentimes people can be quite serious and they don't want to admit that the reason why they're studying something is because they just really love it. And for me, with Elden Ring, I'd never played any of the From Software games, and actually they kind of represented kind of like gamer culture that I felt very kind of locked out of, right? And I was actually very scared of them. But I remember seeing the trailer for Elden Ring probably in like 2021, and I saw these pop boys and I thought, oh yeah, actually, I want to try this game out. And I impulsively bought a PS4 secondhand, and yeah, somehow I found myself doing an archaeological survey of Elden Ring. And what that means is we chose like particular areas in the game and actually mapped them out, creating these to scale plans. And because we weren't using mods or anything else like that, we needed kind of like a unit of measurement in order to create these plans, right? So ended up using the player foot as a unit of measurement, which is very bizarre, but is kind of like an example of these kind of experimental methodologies I've been using for recording kind of like player messages in the game world, and trying to understand what can you learn about players from kind of the messages that they leave behind. And the results of this are really interesting. So kind of Elden Ring and From Software games are often associated with kind of like being very hard and these very gritty games, right? But like in terms of like the messages, they're often like quite comedic and are often about like encouraging players, which is really nice to sort of see in the survey. And in this example, in this particular location, there is a kind of kept finding these messages that were referring to a love, and that's because there was a fan favorite character called Rani that would appear sometimes. So you can see it's kind of like they were referring to online memes through the in-game messaging system. And in this GIF, you can also see kind of in the background, there's like a merchant character. And this scene is like pretty peaceful, right? That's one of the reasons why we surveyed it, is because nothing normally would attack you. So we've now returned to Elden Ring because the DLC has come out for kind of like a follow-up survey. And I wanted to just kind of give this anecdote of kind of the strange experience of doing this kind of work in the game, because previously this has been a very peaceful place, but I'm now playing on the Steam Deck. And in order to take a screenshot on the Steam Deck, you have to press kind of like the Steam button and R1. But unfortunately, the way that like it's key mapped means that every time I do that, I end up like using the right kind of like arm to like slice. And the thing is, if you attack the merchant, they actually become a very overpowered, like strong character that will come after you. So as I was taking a screenshot, I accidentally hit the merchant, and now every time I'm in this area, this merchant is just like coming after me. So an area that was like completely peaceful before is now just completely changed into this, it's like this weird, intense experience of like trying to do this survey while this character is just chasing me around. Yeah, so that was just a silly anecdote that I wanted to give about kind of what it's like to be like a player slash researcher in this game. But now on to archaeological storytelling. And I think that everyone in this room is an archaeologist, and I'm going to prove this right now. So, what do you think has happened in this room? Anyone want to guess? Say it again? Yeah? Why do you think that? Exactly, yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, just to clean it, because I got this on Flickr, and also I realized this is from 2010. I was like, oh, that's an artifact, you know? Yeah. But no, yeah, exactly. There we go. So, kind of the answers you gave, talking about like, you know, the different things that are on the table and how they're associated with each other, this kind of, it draws on an archaeological concept, which is the concept of an assemblage. So let's say like you're doing an excavation and you find a load of kind of like pottery together. You might have certain theories about what's happened based on the assemblage of different artifacts together that you found, right? So kind of my point here was saying that I believe that a lot of people already kind of, without knowing it, kind of apply these things to everyday life. Or in terms of interpreting your environment, you are essentially applying archaeological methods without even thinking about it. And this happens in games as well, right? We have this concept of environmental storytelling. This has gone home, and you know, you've got like kind of, you can see there was some kind of meal previously on this kitchen table. So my kind of, I think that I'm really interested in is kind of thinking about environmental storytelling and how it prompts a player to become an archaeologist in a way to kind of interpret the environment and what they think's happened. And yeah, also there's this concept called the assemblage of play that's something that T.L. Taylor, a scholar, writes about. It's this idea that like when you're thinking about playing video games, you shouldn't just think about what's happening on the screen, but you know, who's playing, what hardware are they interacting, what time of day are they playing, you know, in what room, with who are they playing with. So you can also think about like the archaeology of the player experience even beyond like inside the game itself. And so my case study for this is a game called Nothing Beside Remains. So we've gone from like, you know, the really huge like AAA game Elden Ring, now down to this like tiny, very abstract game that I worked on with my supervisor, Mike Cook. And essentially it's what you can see on the screen here. It's you just kind of, you're this little @ symbol, you move around this ruined village, and when you bump into different objects, you'll get a description of them. And it's just an exploration game. There's no kind of win state. But implicitly, it's kind of inviting you to think, what happened to this place? Why is it like this? And also there's some elements of procedural generation in it as well. So each time you play the game, it will be a little bit different as well. So the reason why there's all these kind of words on the side there is it uses grammar replacement, which means that, for example, in the item descriptions and things like that, different words might be swapped out as well. And so because I'm really interested in how players might be kind of prompted to be archaeologists, we did this survey, an online survey of almost about 200 people, where we got them to play the game and essentially asked them, what do you think happened in this place? And we also kind of tracked their pathway throughout the village as well. So that's what you can see on screen now. You see people just kind of all these different like routes that people took. You can see like the people who just immediately go off the map because that's what people do in games. And as part of this experiment, I was really interested in what would happen if we put in an object that was deliberately anachronistic in terms of all the other material culture in the world. So we put in this pocket watch because there's nothing else that's mechanized in the game. And it has this kind of strange description as well when you kind of like look at it. You can see on the screen there. So this was kind of like, we wanted to see, would this prompt, would people even notice it? Apart from the fact that we wanted to see, would people even try and interpret what happened in this place to begin with, but would they kind of react to the pocket watch? The answer is yes. Yeah, it was really fascinating. And like I'm on the screen, like just to put it in perspective, like this pocket watch is just this like abstract symbol, you know, in this game, right? And people immediately came up with all these different theories and started to think, oh, okay, this is inconsistent with what else I found. So has there been other visitors here? And, you know, in this meta sense, there has been, right? There's all these different people looking at this game. So it's kind of fun that people are kind of thinking about that. We had lots of other interesting results as well, some of which were unintentional. I haven't actually got a slide for this, but there turned out to be a glitch in the game. So when people, you know, those people that try to go outside of the village, they would get stuck. And there's sort of like this particle effect on screen, so it looks like you're in a sandstorm. And so people started to think, well, this village must have been destroyed by a sandstorm. And they came up with like these elaborate theories about it, and it wasn't intentional at all, but they thought it was. So that was kind of an interesting example of how you get this emergent storytelling out of glitches as well. And also another thing that we did is, during kind of like an event at King's College London, we asked people to draw maps based on their gameplay experience. And again, this was really interesting because we got a whole range of different things. Some of them were kind of more conventional, but this example on screen is someone did kind of something that was much more kind of like interpretive. Even like, you know, we've got this like very abstract stuff on screen as you've seen before, and suddenly they're coming up with these like 3D like visuals of like this idea of a church and all these kind of like statues and stuff like that. So it was really interesting to see how people can kind of like, even from minimal information, like come up with these like very kind of detailed interpretations. So now we've got gone from an academic study to archaeology memes, which I think are, you know, just as important. So something, I don't know, I love this. So it's just a long-running joke in archaeology that anytime an archaeologist finds something and they don't know what it is, they will say it's ritual. And this is totally true. I've got to say it is. But actually, I thought it was interesting in terms of thinking about games. It's funny that, you know, in one of these examples it says, you know, an artifact without a clear utilitarian use, ritual object. And it's like, well, what are rituals if not in some ways kind of like ludic or games, right? There's a big overlap between ritual and games. So I'm kind of interested in this kind of like tension around like the idea of things that kind of don't fall into obvious categories and like what we do about that in terms of interpreting the past. And the second thing, this is quite, I mean, it's an academic meme, it's not as fun as the other ones, but like it's probably my favorite quote from archaeology is "The dead don't bury themselves," which Mike Parker Pearson said, and he's a specialist in kind of Stonehenge, for example. And I think this is really interesting because it's very political to think about the past in general, but even about especially kind of like grave goods, for example, something that often gets in the news, and like particular burials. But also something I think a a lot about is how sort of like the games that we design reflect ourselves, like our ideas about the world. And this is true of, say, like archaeological interpretation, right? What people think is possible in terms of the past and what they will interpret kind of might reflect their own worldview. So that's sort of kind of like wider thoughts I had around that. And this now hopefully links into the last case study, which is the Festos discussions, which is a game which is based around a real artifact called the Festos disc, which was found on Crete, dates to the prehistoric Bronze Age, so roughly around 1600 BC. And it's an artifact that I've been kind of obsessed with for years because no one really knows what it is. It's kind of like as big as a like coaster, I'd say. It's this. There's no kind of like. It's just an anomaly. There's nothing else that's been found that's like it. And this actually led some people to think it was a hoax, which is really interesting as well. So there's like all these different theories around it. Some people think it's a board game because it has this spiral design, but it probably isn't. And sort of like there are all these symbols on it, and they don't really quite correspond with like any kind of script that exists at the time. So all kinds of theories. Anyway, because it's kind of an ambiguous object, me and my collaborator, Yunus Rabi, decided to make a game about making games based on the Festos disc. So the idea is you have an archaeologist and a game designer been tasked with making a board game based on it. And the game itself, the Festos discussions, is about controlling conversations between these two characters, where they're like kind of discussing, oh, what should we make? Should this be a one-player or a two-player game? Like, what should the themes of it be? So it's a very kind of like meta game around like the game design process. And I really, that kind of links back to this idea of your interpretations of the past are linked to kind of like your own worldview, what you think is possible. And even like the meta conversations between me and Yunus, me having an archaeology background, Yunus being very experienced game designer, and kind of we are bringing our own kind of expertise to this game and kind of reflecting that in the game itself. As you can see a couple of screenshots there, and actually the idea behind it is that you get different like game elements, and you need like 4 of them to fire the game disc, so to speak, that you put in a kiln, and then at the end you have a game out of that. So that's just kind of one example of where I've gotten to in terms of like my own kind of like past in like my own archaeology inspiring the games that I'm making today. And that is the end. Hopefully that wasn't too quick. Okay. Amazing.
Thank you so much for that. First off, apologies for the tip-tapping from next door. I hope that wasn't too distracting. But we have time for some questions. If I personally found this really, really enlightening. I think this is really amazing. So hopefully you did also. And if there's anything you'd like to ask Florence about this research and about the kind of work going on, please do. I mean, I might also just start because I'm writing stuff down as well. I'm going to get my notes.
I was just going to ask, sorry, when you're surveying a game and it's live, is there any example of archaeology on a live site? Do you know, like real-world archaeology on a live site? So does it?
Yes,
Yeah.
I know what you mean.
Yeah.
No, it's a really good point. Because okay, actually, I was just thinking this through, and I think this kind of works. So when I was working as an archaeologist in London, I was working in what's called commercial archaeology, so things that are development-led. So if there's going to be, like, let's say, I don't know, a new pipeline through a street, that means you have to come and monitor it. So I guess in some ways that is live, right, in the sense that it's a street where people are just walking around anyway. I mean, you're not recording that, but, like, there's this ongoing process of people are doing kind of like, you know, kind of building works and stuff around you, and then you're kind of having to adapt to that.
Yeah.
That's still not quite the same, I think, as what you mean in terms of, especially with Elden Ring, for example, like the messages are like loading in actively from the server all the time, so it's very like ephemeral. And I don't know, I think it's kind of a more non-traditional form of archaeology, I guess, but something I'm thinking of, I now can't remember the name of the person who does this, sorry, but I know there was one person who kind of did like a project around graffiti where they would kind of like go every day to a street where people were like, you know, doing graffiti there, and like kind of each day see how it was changing. I think her name is Sabine Harrer, possibly, yeah. But it makes me think of that, yeah.
Interesting. I don't have any comment on it. I was just interested. What is archaeology? I guess sort of, does it have to be old?
Yeah, no, exactly. No, for me, absolutely not. I think everything. Something I say a lot is I think everything is kind of archaeological. Like you could do an archaeology of this room, and that people call that contemporary archaeology. So it's definitely like seen as more experimental, or maybe a little bit more. Yeah, non-traditional, but for sure, it doesn't have to be old because you can do like archaeologies of the internet or things like that, right? Yeah.
Thank you.
Do you have any more questions in the room? Wonderful. I'll just keep going down the row.
Yeah, I was just thinking about. There are obviously some games where people can physically build structures themselves, although out of pre-existing assets. Maybe they'll model, they'll retexture. But I was just wondering if you had any experience maybe looking at that or considering what it means when you have these like user player-based built spaces.
Yeah, definitely. Actually, I worked on a project in an MMO called Worm Online. It's quite an obscure MMO that came out in 2006 and still exists, precisely for this reason, because being interested in player-made structures, especially Worm has servers that are like over a decade old, and it still has all these structures that still exist. And it has a really interesting mechanic where stuff will degrade over time unless people are constantly maintaining it, which is really cool because then you see like there's this like core community of like 1,000 players that still exists, and they're like maintaining this place, right? They see it as like their heritage. I did a study recently where I went on interviews with people in the game itself. It's called like a go-along kind of interview where like you're going on a walk through a place and it's supposed to kind of like elicit kind of like memories or discussion about that, because I wanted to see how the people that had a history with that kind of what memories and experiences they had associated with these like player-made structures, like for example this giant tunnel through a mountain that would have taken like thousands of hours to make. I think it's so interesting, and there's just so many different ways you could look at that.
We'll keep going.
I was just curious, like when you're doing an archaeological study for a game, do you consult like fan maps? Like, online there's like so much information. Do you look at that? And then when you're done with your study, do you upload it anywhere? And like, how do you share it?
Yeah, really good question. So the answer is yes. Yeah, definitely. I think like for Elden Ring, all the wikis and kind of like stuff like that are absolutely invaluable. And I think it's also an interesting case study in that, like for a lot of people, kind of like the fan community interpretations of that game make it playable for a lot of people. So it's like super important, I think, to look at like the fans and what they're doing. And already, in a way, like there are like fans who maybe they don't say that they're doing archaeology, but I'd say arguably are. So like considering that. In terms of uploading stuff, so this research has all been published online, for example, on a site called Archive, which means that you can download like the PDF for free, but also kind of uploaded, in terms of the first Elden Ring survey, there's stuff on GitHub, and also I've uploaded stuff to the Internet Archive. So trying to make things as accessible as possible so that the communities themselves, like anyone can also like kind of look at it and maybe comment and have like feedback. I can always share stuff in the Discord if anyone's interested.
Hey, I just wanted to say that was amazing, but really, really interesting. I'm definitely going to go and look at all of those. So it's Nothing Beside Remains. That's on.
Yes, it is on itch. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. My question, I'm kind of coming from a similar perspective. I don't know if you'll still be here for the mini talks afterwards, but I'm going to talk about that a bit as well. So I'm an experimental geographer and very involved in like site-specific or landscape research games that are quite complex. And I would also maybe think of myself as a contemporary archaeology type theory type person. And it would be amazing if there were more and more games like this, like inspired by the work that you're doing. But in a lot of ways, people aren't aware of those possibilities on both sides. So it's quite hard to maybe convince people who are making indie games that there's a role for someone who's like a landscape researcher or an experimental landscape thinker, because obviously they can just go and find a map or whatever. And on the other hand, sometimes it's hard to convince geographers, archaeologists, like they're like, what are you talking about, games?
Yeah.
So yeah, do you have any kind of tips for that resistance, or do you have stories about having to struggle with that resistance, or like having to kind of make space for this and hopefully make it take up more space in the future, because it's so exciting and it seems to me like really important work?
Right, thank you. This is a really good question. In terms of having experiences around difficulties with this, yes, a lot. I think I started doing what's called archaeogaming research. Like I did it sort of like alongside my full-time job in like from 2016, and definitely there was like pushback from people like from the beginning, like what archaeology of video games, what is that? There was sort of like an online of community, especially people on, I met people through Twitter. That's how I found out about it to begin with. So I think kind of like meeting other people who are also interested in similar stuff. I guess it's like anything, like that helps to have that community of people who are also interested in it, and then kind of collaborating, maybe setting up events together and stuff like that. And it's such a tricky one. I don't know if I have like a great answer, apart from in some ways I feel like I've just sort of stuck around and kept doing stuff. And maybe that kind of helped. But I think just having more and more conversations with people across different communities. So, for example, whether that be like kind of the indie game scene, or kind of people who are already doing all kinds of like experimental game stuff. So I feel like this isn't necessarily the best answer, just off the top of my head. Yeah, I guess always talking to more people is good. Yeah.
That often seems to be the thing. Like, there's not a great answer for like that particular question. It's like we all kind of have to do it. Like, it's the kind of you build it and they'll come, and then you get there and you realize you're that person. You built it for yourself. And
That's true.
I might jump in with a quick question as well.
Yeah, sure.
Because I love Nothing Beside Remains. I think it's a really incredible project. You had players give you these kind of almost accounts of what they discovered and how they saw it, and then through illustration and stuff. Was there any kind of in-game or kind of game-connected prompt for people to do that, or was that kind of, I'm thinking kind of about kind of secondary and like tertiary sources, like within archaeology or any kind of historical kind of research? Yeah, like how did you frame that as part of the game, or was that like research?
This, I think, is like the next step for MBL, because I feel like this is the next thing. Some kind of feedback we had from the study was people saying like they weren't exactly sure at first what to do in the game, because you really just go straight in, and kind of the survey itself was like the framing, which is a limiting factor, right? And I think exactly as you say, it would be really interesting to have this sense of maybe like different sources, to kind of think about like, the fact that, there might be some kind of like, you're looking at different, like where is the writing coming from, right, that you're reading? Like, is this someone else's interpretation, and what does that mean? Like, do you just take things at face value? So yeah, that's definitely the next step as well. Yeah, definitely, yeah.
Do we have any other questions?
Yeah.
You were talking about video game preservation, or like that, and how is that going in terms of, I guess, the companies that make these games, and talking about preserving them versus keeping them, in a black box somewhere. Like, I don't know. I'm just curious what your perspective is on what's happening there.
I think it's it's really, really hard in the sense that. So I've got a good example for this. When I was working at the British Library, one of the case studies I looked at was a game called The Cartographer's Confession, which was like a mobile app that came out in 2017. And it is already inaccessible. You can't get it in. That's pretty recent, right? And it even won like awards and stuff. It was like critically acclaimed, but just through various things that happened, it got taken off the App Store. And so through that project, I ended up contacting the people who made it, and kind of got basically like all the different kind of the visuals, the music, and everything together. So it's almost like you've got all the puzzle pieces of this original game, right, that now the British Library has. So technically you could kind of put it together. But even in an institution like the British Library, they have a lot of difficulty around just like internally it being taken seriously, like games preservation, right, because they're not set up for like things like games. So from my perspective, it feels like there's lots of different like places that are trying to work on this, and they all have their own kind of like remits, but there's limited resources, there's difficulties around kind of, there's like legal issues, right, around like what you can kind of preserve, and then also just the industry itself can be so secretive, because, you know, IP and stuff, people don't want to share that. So I think more and more work has been done on it, but at the same time, things are being just lost constantly. Yeah.
As I stroll over, if you're interested in that, there is the Video Game Heritage Society who are doing some really interesting work. Yeah, so VHS, wonderful acronym. And also the National Video Game Museum, where I think the VHS, like a couple of the people working on VHS are based. So you can look into those if you're interested in that kind of stuff. The British Library are obsessed with bit rot at the moment in terms of digital preservation, that everything you put into any hard drive anywhere, no matter where it is slowly degrading also.
Thanks. And also, it was really beautiful to see that screen where you could see the pathways of different players. That's so fascinating because kind of connected to what you were just talking about, because obviously the game itself is fascinating, but the play style of different players is also fascinating. I looked at Caves of Quad. I don't know if you know. Yeah. So that's quite interesting because I looked at an example playthrough where veteran video game players, when they play Caves of Quad, they quite often immediately are like, I'm going to go and exploit something. I'm going to go underground. It looks like somewhere where I can go underground and find some exploitable resource. Whereas geographers play it and they just go and try and taxonomize. So they're just wandering, basically, the roving geographer. So just, do you have any practical tips for like, what do you actually use to track that data? I liked how you visualized the data. That was really beautiful. Like, are there any like tips for that kind of?
So in terms of like the actual tracking of that was kind of my supervisor did a lot of the like stuff behind that. And I think essentially kind of the way it was set up is, of course, like we got people's consent before doing it. But because we had like a special bespoke version of the game that people would kind of play for the study, and then anyone who kind of like played it, it would kind of like immediately kind of, I think, track every few like seconds. I'm trying to remember like where someone's position was, just because it's a lot of data basically, and so you kind of got to limit it in some way. And then that would kind of be kind of sent to a server and then kept, and then it was also each player would have like an anonymous ID, and so that would be associated with them. So that way, yeah, we can kind of see like, we can even match where someone has gone, but also like what they've written as their interpretation, which is really interesting, right? Because maybe someone only went in one area, and so they've got a very specific perspective on the world, and you might think, oh, maybe that's influenced why they have this interpretation of what happened in the place. Yeah. But I can definitely get you more like information on that.
Yeah, I'd be so interested.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
You just mentioned like limiting factors. I think that's very interesting as well. Like obviously the kind of practical or physical archaeological limitations, money, time, energy, resources, like exist within this kind of thing as well, within kind of digital and kind of ludic architecture as well, archaeology as well. Are there any other kind of specific limitations that you find, kind of like this, like having to choose how much data you take, that kind of thing? Like, what are the hurdles that you find with the research you're doing that might not exist otherwise in other fields?
Yeah, I think really just thinking of Elden Ring, for example, we're kind of in the process of doing the survey for the DLC. And there's just so much data you could collect, right? Like you could keep going forever, I think, and especially if you're passionate about it, right? It's almost like having to like limit yourself, like in terms of, I keep thinking, well, I could go in and kind of look at this area of the DLC and this, like, well, what if we find that? And it's true, you'll keep finding stuff, but having to kind of know when to cut off. And I think that's the kind of, it's this this two-sided thing with digital stuff, right? Because we were saying like it's so fragile, it is, but at the same time there's a lot of it, at least initially, like so kind of being able to like I guess take a representative sample, at least as best you can. I think it is kind of a struggle. I don't know. Yeah, they're just being a lot.
Do you have any other questions? I mean, I have one last one as well. Yeah. I find this stuff fascinating. I think this stuff is brilliant.
Thank you.
I've been looking into a game called Fuser recently, which is basically a DJing game made by the people who made like Rock Band and stuff like that. And it only lasted 2 years because of licensing. And there's a really big modding community who basically revived it and made a kind of like grey market version where you can put custom songs in and things like this. And I think that's really fascinating. But it feels like it's not an archaeological exercise because they're trying to bring it back to life, as opposed to like even people who are recreating like Saxon villages or whatever are doing that as a way to show what it was like. They're not trying to live like that again.
Yeah,
like, do you find similar kind of crossovers with things like Elden Ring, for example, if you're looking at players and kind of research, do you find players have different kind of goals in looking for things or trying to categorize things than you do, like in the research you're doing?
Yeah, definitely. So something I've found interesting is that, so with my research specifically on Elden Ring, I'm very interested in kind of almost like these traces that people like leave behind, whether that's messages or like there are also bloodstains, like when people die they get left, and so that's an accidental thing usually, right? That people, I mean, they might mean to die, but like other times they probably don't, and it's really interesting. But I think, for example, there is a YouTuber called Tarnished Archaeologist, I believe, and there's like other kind of like people, their interpretations of the archaeology of Elden Ring are very much about sort of like the world itself, so kind of like trying to understand the lore of Elden Ring, which of course is like just as valid. All these things are like super interesting. So no, I don't know, something that I found interesting is that people like maybe sometimes gravitate towards that as opposed to like kind of maybe other forms of archaeology. But I think ultimately it's good to just have more of this stuff, right? Like looking at all these different sources, whether it's like, the fan wikis, like, kind of like archaeological interpretations of the environmental storytelling in Elden Ring. That's what it is, essentially, Or kind of like what people call it, like almost like the forensic analysis, I think, of the game, where they try and look at like how it might have changed over time, or like look under kind of like the models of characters and stuff like that, and be like, oh, how did this change? So there's like all these different ways you can kind of approach it, and I think it's just good to have these different perspectives.
Amazing. We have time for one more, I think, and then we should wrap. Does anyone have any burning thoughts, comments, questions?
Hello. You were very briefly mentioned Lara Croft at the start, and I was just thinking of, do you have any sort of favorite? Are there any other archaeologist video game characters, and also, is there a game that you think like nails archaeology? You're like, this is the most real life archaeological gaming experience.
I guess so. I think my answer for this is something like kind of like the Uncharted games, or like Tomb Raider. They're like kind of on the surface seem to be about archaeology, but not really. Whereas I think like probably the most archaeological games in general, I often say, are like walking simulators, because they are about like going through an environment and interpreting what happened. So I had like Gone Home as an example there. I don't know if that's like the archaeology game for sure, but I think that would kind of be my answer.
I think you should make one, maybe.
Yeah. That is the dream.
Do it yourself,
Well, the next version, 2.0.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I saw you also had a hand up at the same time. Should we squeeze one last one in?
Very similar question.
Oh, fantastic.
For game recommendations. This was really inspiring. I really liked In Other Waters.
Yes, yeah.
It was basically the same question, but if you haven't played it, In Other Waters is also really good. You're a xenobiologist. It's a, like kind of I think of it as cartographic, but it's also archaeological.
Yeah, definitely. Have you played Her Story? Yes. That's another really good. Yeah. Absolutely, yeah. And like interacting with an archive. Yeah.
And the other one that comes to mind, that it's quite a recent one, more into the kind of documentation of these things, is A Hand with Many Fingers, which, if you haven't heard, is great. It's very secondary sources. You like all of the work has been done, and you're just given the archive, and you have to piece together what this story is. It's quite dry, and I think that that's important. Like, I think that being a little bit boring is kind of like, that's where I really like enjoy games.
Yeah.
But I think that's probably a wonderful place to kind of wrap there. Thank you so much, Florence, for joining us. This has been really, really incredible.